Howdy doody folks, and welcome back to our journey across the United States. Today we're venturing to Illinois to take a closer look at some of your strangest urban legends. From stories of a strange World War II era gasser to scarcely documented cases of spontaneous human combustion, your state did not disappoint, and clearly you don't do boring. Now quickly before we get started, I just want to say if you enjoy this content, liking this video, subscribing, and commenting will help this relatively small channel keep growing, because maybe it's ambitious of me to say, but one day I would love if I could hit 1 million subs here on YouTube. Doing this will never cost you a single dime, and it's a quick way to say, hey YouTube, this guy's alright. Anyhow, with that, come with me today and let's explore some of Illinois' weirdest lore. First up, we're heading to Seneca, Illinois, for a strange little case where one very unlucky woman may have taken the old tradition of Christmas bonfires just a little bit too seriously. This story, appropriately since it's December, begins on December 24th, Christmas Eve, of 1885. Mr. and Mrs. Rooney were at home with their farmhand named John Larson, and according to some sources, their son, John Rooney. The Rooneys had reportedly enjoyed quite a bit of whiskey that night. In fact, official records politely state that Mr. and Miss Rooney were addicted to the excessive use of whiskey, which is a charmingly Victorian way of saying these folks could have gone drink for drink with the distillery. At some point that evening, the farmhand would go to bed. It's said he slept upstairs, and that was the last moment anyone ever saw Miss Rooney alive. And here's where the story takes a weird little turn. This farmhand, described in period sources as a Swedish man who was almost an imbecile and perfectly harmless, normally woke up at 5 a.m. sharp. But on this particular Christmas morning, he mysteriously slept in until 8, and when he finally woke, he found himself nearly unable to breathe, almost asphyxiated in his room. The door shut tight. He stumbled downstairs, and immediately he saw signs that something terrible might have happened in the kitchen. Many retellings claim that the farmhand discovered the bodies himself, but the primary source I'm using, written by the coroner, suggests something different. That Larson, disoriented and half suffocated, merely realized something was very wrong and ran for help rather than explore the house. Neighbors would arrive afterwards, take one look, and alert authorities. LaSalle County Coroner Dr. Floyd Clendenin caught a train to Seneca and arrived to find a crowd gathered around a scene straight out of a horror movie, really. Mr. Rooney was deceased, lying on the floor near his bed in the room adjacent to the kitchen. His door was open to whatever had filled this house with smoke. But Mrs. Rooney, she was missing. Well, missing except for all but about 12 pounds of her. Inside the kitchen, the furniture was undisturbed. A tallow candle on the table, her nightly custom to extinguish before going to bed, was out. The house was lit entirely by these simple little candles, and in the middle of the room there was something no one expected to see. A hole burned clean through the kitchen floor, down about 2 feet to the ground beneath. On the dirt below, there was a heap of cinders, in which lay a nearly cremated skull, a cervical vertebrae, and half the dorsal vertebrae. Also in the pile were feet, still in their shoes. The shoes were burned, but not entirely destroyed. Everything else, the flesh, the clothing, and other bones, had been reduced from a roughly 160-pound woman to 12 pounds of cinders and fragments. In short, it appeared that Miss Rooney had gone up in flames completely, without even disturbing the room around her at all. No signs of a struggle, nothing else seriously burned. The smoke from her burning body also seems to have filled the house, which immediately killed Mr. Rooney and nearly killed the farmhand, who actually later died from smoke inhalation just 2 weeks after this case. And just to keep things interesting, my source for all of this is actually a medical journal. Admittedly a very old one though, and this article was named A Case of Spontaneous Combustion in Man, written by Dr. Clendenin himself. So we're not dealing with a campfire tale. This is the coroner describing what he saw, which is pretty insane to me. Now, I'm not going to drag us too far down this spontaneous human combustion rabbit hole today, but this case raises quite a few questions. Now, personally, I think the Rooneys probably drank way beyond their tolerance that night, Maybe Mr. Rooney was so far gone he couldn't react to the smoke until it was too late, and maybe Mrs. Rooney was so intoxicated that when she caught on fire, however that happened, she couldn't put it out. And there were flames present in the house after all. She had that routine of extinguishing tallow candles before bed, and who knows, maybe a bit of burning wax dropped onto her clothing, or maybe she leaned too close to an open flame. That's one explanation. But then there's the other side of the debate. Now, I think everyone listening in on this video knows very well that while the human body, our fat and such, can burn reasonably well, our bones are another story. Many people who read this story rightfully come away asking, if this was a simple fire, how on earth did all but a couple of bones and her feet essentially disappear? Further, some folks are interested in the whole spontaneity aspect of this potential fire, and they point to the fact that plenty of things in nature, piles of hay, stacks of oily rags, heaps of leaves, can self-heat and spontaneously combust. Thus, some people insist there's a still unknown mechanism that could cause human bodies to catch on fire in a similar way. Anyhow, what do you think? Was this a tragic accident, helped along by excessive Christmas cheer, or a genuine case of spontaneous human combustion? Let me know in the comments below. I'm curious which camp you fall into. If you've ever wondered what happens when a small Midwestern town, a world war, and a mysterious, sweet-smelling vapor collide, welcome to Mattoon, Illinois, in 1944. And yes, transitioning from spontaneous human combustion to a Mad Gasser kind of feels natural. Fire, smoke, gas, you get it, it all asphyxiates you pretty darn well. Anyhow, before we jump into this sweet, sickly haze of Mattoon, it's worth noting that this wasn't the first time Americans heard about a so-called gas prowler. Now, if you remember from our Virginia video, back in 1933, a strangely similar and pretty much equally well-detailed saga unfolded in Botetourt County, Virginia. Not to speculate, but after reading pretty much every primary source regarding both of these Gasser episodes, I really have to wonder, did the media in this small town of Mattoon read about this Gasser saga from a decade prior? Either way, combine strange smells with the stress of World War II, and you've got a population on your hands that is primed for suspicion, fear, and maybe a little touch of mass hysteria. And so, our story begins in Mattoon, Illinois, a small community about 50 miles south of Champaign, Illinois. The Mad Gasser saga is usually said to begin in late August or early September, but there was possibly a strange incident earlier that summer that was linked to this case, involving a woman named Miss Olive Brown. I say possibly because it actually wouldn't be until after the initial publications that Mrs. Olive Brown came forward about the events she experienced, claiming that around June she'd smelled a sickly sweet odor around midnight one night and suddenly felt nauseous and partially paralyzed. To summarize her reasoning for not reporting that she was, paralyzed, it was because she didn't want to cause a fuss. Big time grandma energy with this one. Grandmas out there, by golly, we love ya, and if you end up randomly paralyzed, please go talk to your doctor. Anyhow, I digress, but there is also another potentially linked detail that I should talk about too. I know everyone's always excited about the strange odors and such with this case, but on August 30th of 1944, there was something else. See, a German soldier named Wilhelm Ziegler casually just walked away from one of his guards at Camp Ellis, a camp holding German soldiers nearby. And where did he go? He went into Mattoon. That's right, at 4 p.m. he showed up at the Mattoon post office. He was acting strangely, speaking with a thick German accent, and attempting to buy a 1-cent stamp. And if he'd just, said yes to the offer to have them for free because he was a member of the armed forces, he'd probably have never been reported. But he declined, meaning he was noticed, and a woman at the post office would report him to the police. He was seen again then in a lounge later, after which a German coin mysteriously popped out of a jukebox, which people assumed was his. Then Ziegler was caught the next day, on August 31st, and returned to Camp Ellis. But I have to wonder if a seed was planted by this. I mean, this Mattoon saga is literally one of concern about Axis power operatives poisoning the American people, and it seems all too coincidental that hours earlier before this saga started, a literal German soldier had been strolling around in Mattoon. Anyhow, with this in mind, the real action of this Mattoon saga would begin. See, at 3 a.m. on September 1st, one Urban Rafe of 1817 Grant Avenue was jolted awake by a sharp, sweet, sickly odor spreading throughout his home. He grew nauseous and he began to vomit, and he thought maybe it was their kitchen stove, so he would demand his wife check on the pilot light. But as soon as she did so, she became temporarily paralyzed. It's worth noting a third person was actually visiting this home, and they were unaffected, leading them to believe the gas entered specifically through their bedroom window. They survived, though, of course, they told the authorities, and soon headlines proclaimed things like anesthetic prowler covers city, ether spray gun bandit, and a young chemist with an unrestrained experimental urge, and more. And as you might expect, this little push was all the town really needed to jump on this Mad Gasser bandwagon, and in the coming weeks, to say there was a plethora of reports of similar activity would have been an understatement. On September 7th, one Bert Kearney of 1408 Marshall Avenue claimed he saw, I quote, the prowler at his wife's bedroom window upon returning home from work, describing this man as tall, thin, wearing dark clothing, a railway-style cap, and capable of leaping over a 4-foot fence. Sounds pretty strapping for a man seen beside your wife's bedroom window, if you ask me, but hey, I'll leave that to the chapters of history. Further, around this time, one Ryder household on Prairie Avenue also had quite the experience. Miss Ryder and the children smelled the sweet odor and became lightheaded and restless. She said it didn't quite smell like chloroform, but that it was definitely unpleasant. Then, on December 5th, more evidence would come forward than some simple smells. One Miss Beulah Cords, a 47-year-old local, would discover a cloth with red stains on her porch, which she described as looking like someone had dripped liquid from a lipstick tube on it. She'd, for some reason, even in the midst of this saga, sniffed this cloth, and immediately she became paralyzed. I should note there's no mention in papers of what happened to this cloth, but this is the story. Also on this day, one Miss Leonard Burrell of 809 13th Street woke up at about 11:15 p.m. to fumes in her home, which caused her to run with her son Dennis to a neighbor's home, where she'd call her husband. December 6th, following this, may have been the biggest night of all, though, with 7 separate gas incidents, numerous sightings of the prowler, and more, all despite a purposeful increase in police presence around the city. On this night, Laura Junkin of 821 Richmond Avenue was hit by fumes when entering the rear apartment of her cafe, becoming paralyzed and weak after smelling what she described as cheap perfume. One Ardell Spangler of 821 North 15th Street smelled the fumes and had a coughing fit, and there was even a weird joint incident where one Fred Goebel smelled the odor and became nauseous, reporting it at approximately the same time that his neighbor, Robert Daniels, reported seeing a tall man by the Goebel family residence's window, which actually fled, running through the yard. Despite all of these reports, whenever the police arrived, they found nobody. Then, on September 7th, Frances Smith, principal of Columbian Grade School, and her sister, Maxine, reported strange odors multiple times, temporary paralysis, burning mouth sensations, and Frances claimed that when she turned on her bedroom window, she saw a thin, smoky vapor, like cigarette smoke, and heard a faint buzzing sound. Around this same time, the local police chief revealed that the local high school's important chemical set was missing, specifically one that included materials needed to make mustard gas and lewisite, both of which have sweetish odors and can cause temporary paralysis. Anyhow, nothing to worry about, of course, just the potential for some light chemical warfare out there on the streets of Mattoon. Then, on September 8th, Mr. and Miss Warren Driscoll of 2320 Dewitt Avenue reported that their daughter was reading near a window, and she saw a man on their porch actively spraying fumes. Police, of course, did what they were best at throughout the saga, suggesting the culprit might have been one of 4 recently discharged high school-aged Army chemistry students, or maybe a rogue nurse with access to medical compounds. You know, just narrowing it down to about half the town. Further, on September 10th, 2 unnamed women, one on Champaign Avenue and another on Moultrie Avenue, went to Memorial Hospital with symptoms. From what I can tell, this is the first time in this whole saga anyone even thought to ask a doctor about what was going on, and a physician actually examined these women and declared them perfectly healthy, diagnosing them with, I quote, extreme nervous tension. Then, in the final final documented Gasser episode on September 12th, police, clearly overwhelmed and now leaning heavily towards the mass panic explanation, publicly stated that the events were the result of wartime anxiety, specifically saying a sign of the anxiety felt by women while local men were away on war service. Yes, they actually said that. Now after this, the saga tapered off. The only notable post-announcement incident came from one Bertha Birch, who claimed she saw the gasser, described the figure as a woman dressed like a man, and reported finding a woman's footprint. This was not incredibly helpful, considering Mattoon was home to many women who wore shoes. And just like the Botetourt County case, the entire Mattoon saga ends abruptly, with no culprit ever identified, no chemicals ever confirmed, and no answers that satisfied anyone. Just a lot of fumes, a lot of fear, and a lot of newspapers selling a lot of copies. But as for a definitive explanation, that's still missing, kind of like that high school chemistry set, or that person you dated in high school that said they just needed a break. Anyhow, let me know. Have you heard of this saga before, and what do you think the Mad Gasser actually was? If you've ever dipped your toes into Chicago urban legends, one story that probably stands out above many others is the story of the Great Chicago Fire, and that it began because Miss O'Leary's cow, apparently in a moment of pure bovine rage or poor attitude, kicked over a lantern and burned the city to the ground. The classic timeline goes about like this. Around 8:30 p.m. on October 8th of 1871, behind 137 West DeKoven Street, a small barn belonging to the O'Leary family would go up in flames. According to the legend, Catherine O'Leary, a Catholic Irish immigrant, had gone out to milk her cow and left a lantern in a precarious spot. The cow, named Daisy, Madeline, or Gwendolyn, or whatever name your great-aunt uses when she tells this story, supposedly kicked over the lantern. The hay ignited around it, and that tiny little flame became an unstoppable firestorm. It bears noting a months-long drought had turned Chicago into basically a giant wooden tinderbox at this point. This was aided by the fact that strong southwesterly winds pushed the flames northeast across the west side. The fire leapt the south branch of the river, tore through the business district, crossed the main river, and devastated the north side. Homes, factories, grain elevators, even the waterworks, they were gone. More than 17,000 buildings burned, and about 100,000 people were left homeless, with at least 300 dying. The fire finally burned itself out on October 10th when the winds died down and rain began to fall. And in the aftermath, shell-shocked, grieving, and looking for someone to blame, the public turned to Catherine O'Leary. Now, before the fire, I should note she'd been practically anonymous, but afterwards, she became the face of disaster. Anti-Irish and anti-immigrant sentiment did a lot of the heavy lifting. Newspapers, desperate for a spicy headline, painted her as careless, backward, and superstitious. Neighbors began passing around rumors that they saw her barn ignite, or that they found broken lantern glass inside, despite the fact that the people claiming they saw it happen were, alive and standing to tell the tale rather than being burnt to a crisp at the scene of the crime. But I digress. In response to these rumors, the Board of Inquiry actually dragged Catherine in and questioned her directly. She insisted, of course, she hadn't even been to the barn at the time, and frankly, no evidence existed to contradict her. Thus, the board officially cleared her, and a later literature-driven investigation in 1997 completely exonerated her and declared that she had been unfairly scapegoated. But none of that mattered. The legend stuck, and for more than a century, people preferred the idea of one clumsy cow and one irresponsible Irish woman over the far more complicated truth. Chicago was a wooden city, built on dry kindling during an exceptionally hot, windy season. The fire didn't need a cow. The fire needed one spark. Any spark, really. Regardless, Catherine O'Leary's life was turned upside down. She was falsely branded a welfare queen, and that she was seeking revenge for being cut off of public assistance, despite never having taken a dime from the government. Further, reporters wrote fake interviews with her every anniversary of the fire, and they doctored photos of her posing with the cursed cow. Thus, she often closed her blinds, avoided photographers, and became portrayed as almost witch-like in some caricatures or political cartoons. By 1879, the harassment she faced became so overwhelming that the O'Leary family actually sold their cottage and moved to the outskirts of the city. Catherine here would become a recluse, leaving only for errands and church, and the legend gnawed at her mental health for the rest of her life. She would ultimately die of pneumonia in 1890, still haunted by something she didn't do. And even then, people didn't leave her alone. Visitors would desecrate her grave. A vaudeville song, A Hot Time in Old Town, would gleefully blame her for the blaze. And every year, reenactors marched through Chicago with a cow in tow, pretending to be her. Of course, as stated, the truth is far murkier. Now, nobody knows exactly how the fire started, but the theories that are tossed around, some of which might also be folklore, include that one Daniel Pegleg Sullivan reportedly started the fire, actually knocking over a lantern while trying to steal milk from a cow in the O'Leary barn. He was nicknamed Pegleg because he had a peg leg. Big surprise. There's another story that a group of boys were playing craps in the barn and knocked over the lantern while fleeing Catherine's scolding. And the wildest theory of all that I found was that Biela's comet was raining fiery fragments on Chicago, even though meteorites haven't ever been documented to start fires, and the comet wasn't even really close to Earth that year. So yeah, probably not. The most plausible explanation is simply that the city, as I said, was primed for disaster anyways, being dry, windy, and largely made of wood. Evidence of this, funny enough, can be seen in the fact that conditions were so bad during this exact same period that I kid you not, four catastrophic fires erupted across the region. The Peshtago Fire in Wisconsin, still the deadliest fire in American history, killed between 1,200 and 2,500 people the day of this fire. Further, Holland, Michigan burned, Port Huron burned, and Manistee, Michigan burned. It was a week of firestorms in the Midwest, to say the least. Regardless, the urban legend about Miss O'Leary and her cow persists, even to this day, but the evidence overwhelmingly supports the opposite, that Catherine O'Leary didn't start the Great Chicago Fire. She was at the scene of the crime, sure, but almost certainly was not its cause. Her reputation, sadly, never did get the same chance to be extinguished, though. If you're ever drifting down the Mississippi River near Alton, Illinois, and you start to feel like the cliffs are watching you, congratulations. You might have stumbled upon the site of an old imposing image, the site of the largest known Native American mural ever made, but a mural that today is part folklore and part American history. This story begins in the 1660s with Père Jacques Marquette, a French Jesuit missionary who was basically the overachiever of New France. He showed up in the Great Lakes region, learned multiple Native American languages like it was nothing, helped establish missions across the St. Lawrence River, and eventually befriended the Illini, a confederation of tribes living in what's now Illinois. These native people liked him enough to invite him south, and while he was there, he was told about a massive trade route that the locals knew well, on a river so wide and powerful that Europeans had actually only seen its southern end. This river, of course, was the Mississippi River, and then in 1673, Marquette teamed up with the explorer Louis Joliet for the first European expedition down its upper stretches. Now on this paddle, somewhere near present-day Alton, Illinois, while paddling below towering limestone bluffs, they noticed something high above them, something so unexpected and vivid that even Marquette had trouble putting it into words. He described two enormous painted monsters, calf-sized bodies, deer-like horns, red eyes, tiger beards, human-ish faces, coils of reptilian tail wrapping clear around their body, and scales ending in a fish-like fin. And perched in a spot the contemporary French artists would have struggled to reach, these figures left Marquette convinced that savages, as he called them, surely couldn't have made something so sophisticated, because apparently these same people who built the sprawling, astronomically aligned population of London-sized city of Cahokia couldn't also paint a picture. Sure, Jacques, whatever you say, bud. In reality, these murals absolutely were created by the indigenous people of the region, likely tied directly to the powerful Mississippian world centered at Cahokia between 1050 and 1350 CE. For the record, Cahokia was a metropolis with dense neighborhoods, defensive walls, a 40-acre public plaza, and more than 120 mounds arranged with elite precision. The cliffs where Marquette saw the paintings were squarely in the cultural orbit of this civilization, and the Piasa Piasa imagery may have served as a boundary marker or warning to travelers that they were crossing into powerful sacred territory. But what's most wild is this. Remember, if Cahokia had declined by roughly 1350 and Marquette didn't see this mural until about 1673, that means this mural he saw would have lasted on the cliff face for hundreds of years at least. And that longevity, it wasn't luck. It came down to lithographic limestone, a kind of rock formed in calm ancient lakes that's so fine-grained and smooth that it holds images with incredible crispness. Yes, just like a Pringle. Its chemistry helps separate oil and water perfectly, which is why centuries later, humans used it for printing lithographs. Now, the native artists didn't have a chemistry textbook or anything, but they clearly knew the stone's power. Thus, their work endured because the medium was practically made for art. And if later generations had treated this site with respect, the original paintings, I'd guess, would even still be visible today. But, as was tradition for our early 1800s counterparts, they didn't treat anything with respect. To start, Native American travelers reportedly used this mural for target practice with rifles, which some think might have been ceremonial, so I'll maybe give this one a pass. That said, by the late 1800s, because humans never miss an opportunity to destroy something irreplaceable, settlers literally just quarried the cliff. Not preserved, not protected, quarried. They quarried a 1,000-year-old masterpiece for building materials. Fantastic job, everyone. Still, the story didn't fade, but it was treated with a bit of, let's say, creative agency. In the 1830s, a Greek and Latin professor named John Russell would swoop in with what can only be described as historic fanfiction. He claimed that Piasa meant the bird who devoured men, and spun a dramatic myth about a winged man-eating monster defeated by Chief Atauga and his warriors with poisoned arrows. Great story, but as you might have guessed, it was entirely made up. Russell even later admitted this to his son, that it was an inspired invention. Regardless, his tale spread through newspapers, caught the public imagination, and eventually overshadowed Marquette's real description of the mural. Thus, this is why most modern depictions of the Piasa show a winged dragon-like creature, even though the original completely lacked wings, and this is why it's called the Piasa Bird. Today, in memory of Russell's version of the creature, a recreated Piasa mural stands on the bluffs at Piasa Park in Alton, Illinois. It's fantastic to look at, though probably a little bit different from what Marquette saw. Even the plaque near it retells Russell's fictional version instead of the historical version of when this mural was first seen. Still, the image endures, though, across the region. As someone with deep family roots in southern Illinois, when I was a kid, I thought the whole Piasa Bird thing was really cool, and I've driven past Southwestern High School in Piasa, Illinois more times than I can count, admiring their massive art piece of the creature, the Piasa Bird, the school's mascot and local legend. The modern version may be a little more dragon cosplay than ancient Mississippian art, but the spirit remains. A creature painted so boldly that even 350 years after Marquette first looked up at that cliff and froze, eyes wide, mouth open, we're still talking about it today. When I was a kid, admittedly, I had the luxury of not being afraid of much. Sure, there was this one kid named Nathan in my neighborhood who did karate and would occasionally jump out of the bushes and try to fight me, which I didn't really enjoy. And there was this other kid, Vince, in the neighborhood who was a lot bigger than me and always took a suspiciously deep interest in the contents of your wallet, but even he wasn't much of an issue because you could just run away from him because he didn't do much but swing a baseball bat at practice a couple days a week. By the way, Vince, if you ever hear this, you're a dumb loser for picking on 14-year-olds. But if I'd been a child in Chicago in the 1990s, I might not have been so bold. At the very least, I probably wouldn't have been out wandering the streets, because as the legend goes, there was a man, maybe folklore, maybe real, who drove around dressed as a clown, cruising the neighborhoods and hovering near elementary schools. Kids, of course, called this man Homey the Clown. Now, let's clear one thing up. There was a real fictional character named Homey the Clown on the 90s sketch show In Living Color, played by Damon Wayans. He was an ex-con clown. Imagine a bargain bin Twisty from American Horror Story, who carried around a weighted sock that he'd used to bop people up on the head. If you've ever heard the phrase, "Homie, don't play that," you've brushed up against his legacy. Heck, he even got his own movie in 2007. But that homie wasn't the one Chicago kids were whispering about in the 90s. Their Homey the Clown was something else entirely. A mysterious man in clown gear driving a white van through Chicago and its suburbs, parking near schools, supposedly trying to lure kids inside. And according to articles and forum posts from people who grew up there, this wasn't just some random rumor. It was kind of everywhere. No matter where you went to school or church or what social group you belonged to, kids were claiming they'd seen Homey. Some older kids even formed little vigilante groups, insisting that they were going to catch him. Now, from what I can tell, nobody actually got abducted, but he did terrify kids all over the city. In their minds, Homey was always lurking, right around the corner, waiting for you to stay out a little too late or let your guard down for half a second. And remarkably, no matter where you grew up, Northside Christian School or deep Southside neighborhood, the details were pretty much the same. It even escalated to the point where teachers got sucked into the panic. There were accounts of teachers seeing a white van drive by during recess and immediately herding kids inside before calling the police. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds like a classic case of kids freaking each other out over an urban legend. And maybe that's true, but this thing gained serious traction. For one, it reached the local news. On October 9th of 1991, WFLD-TV ran a 30-second spot announcing that police believed the whole Homey hysteria was just that, nonsense. But 2 days later, on October 11th, the Chicago Tribune ran an article claiming police were taking the sightings seriously. The coverage ping-ponged like this for a little while, from skeptics calling it bogus to officials saying, okay, we're looking into it. Some people even speculated that the clown in the van was a leftover accomplice of John Wayne Gacy, the notorious serial killer and amateur clown who prowled Illinois in the 70s. I guess Gacy's shadow still loomed heavily over the region, so any clown-related rumor was like pouring gasoline on a smoldering fire. Anyhow, if you were a kid in Chicago back then, were you haunted by the Homey the Clown rumors, and did you have school assemblies about it? Did your friends swear they saw him outside the playground fences? Let me know, because judging by the accounts, this was one legend nobody in Chicagoland could escape. This tale goes all the way back to my very first Weird Folklore video. See, back in that Ohio episode, I stumbled on this bizarre story about a man who died, and then for reasons known only to the locals, had his corpse displayed in a shed for decades. People would swing by to marvel at the so-called mummy. They'd dress him up in costumes, and at one point they even carted him off to the Ohio State University to prop him up on a bench as a prank. At the time, I thought, wow, that's absolutely terrible, but surely this hasn't happened anywhere else. Oh, how wrong I was. Because in Alton, Illinois, the self-proclaimed most haunted town in America, they too appropriately had their very own mummy, and not for a couple of years, they had one for more than 80. Our story opens like something out of a gothic carnival sideshow, with a once hard-of-hearing fisherman known for staggering along the riverbed and shouting drunken sermons to anyone within a 5-mile radius. This man was referred to as Deaf Bill Lee. Now, historically speaking, we don't know much about Bill, except for a handful of newspaper articles written in the early 1900s, one from 1902 gleefully announcing the marriage of William Lee, best known as Deaf Bill, the Poobah of McPike Island, that's what they call him, to one Mary A.H. Ferguson of Paxton, Illinois, who apparently found his near-total deafness charming enough. The article even added, with absolutely zero subtlety, that she was, I quote, satisfied with her choice, notwithstanding the fact that Bill could hardly hear. That's a direct quote. Romance isn't dead, folks, it's just loudly repeating itself because it didn't catch the first thing you said. Then, in 1914, the Alton Evening Telegraph reported that Bill was serving time in the St. Charles County Jail for stealing a mechanic's tools, after someone else had robbed his houseboat. Why retaliatory theft was the chosen solution, I can't tell you, but the irony is spectacular. Then, sadly, a year later, in October of 1915, the same paper described him being found collapsed on the Missouri side of the river. Despite this inconvenient detail, Bill apparently insisted that because he spent all of his money in Illinois, that Illinois should be the one responsible for him, and remarkably, the county agreed, and he was admitted to the Madison County poorhouse, where he passed away shortly after. And this is where things could have ended quietly enough. No family came forward to claim him, so his body landed in the custody of the Bauer Funeral Home, later the Burke Funeral Home. Normally, an unclaimed man would, be buried in a potter's field. Sad, but at least somewhat respectful. But instead, they embalmed him with a then experimental method that, for some reason, involved skipping the actual embalming fluid, and the dry air did the rest. Slowly, over time, Bill's body dehydrated until he became a stiff, dark, leathery, almost kind of petrified figure. Less person and more wood carving your uncle swears he didn't buy at a yard sale kind of vibe. This strange state of affairs sparked all kinds of ideas. At one point in 1932, someone suggested displaying him at the Chicago World's Fair, and I don't think that plan got far, but there was an incident where, according to the papers, an, I quote, Egyptian Hindu stopped by the funeral home and offered $2,500 for Bill's body, and when told he couldn't legally buy it, instead he said they could make a fortune exhibiting the money. And somehow, this was all the encouragement the Bauer Funeral Home needed to go forward with this. So naturally, I don't know if they made any money off of this, but they didn't bury him. They displayed him instead. And when the funeral home later moved to a new building at 727 Langdon Street, they built a special closet just for Bill. They placed him upright, they put a diaper on him, which don't think too hard about that, and they stood him in this little shrine to poor decisions, and left him there to await the burial he wouldn't get for another 8 decades. As the years rolled on, Deaf Bill transformed from forgotten fisherman to full-blown local folklore. Kids in Alton went to the funeral home asking to see Deaf Bill, and they'd press their faces to the closet door, staring at the leathery figurine inside, and daring each other to poke the mummy. And this continued for generations. Even as the funeral home changed ownership, Bill stayed right there in the closet, the world's most morbid long-term tenant. Eventually, even the funeral directors probably realized how messed up this was, and there are records that they tried to offload him onto the Alton Museum of History and Art, but the museum understandably said absolutely not. By the 1990s, Bill was no longer seen as an attraction, but as a deeply unsettling relic. Someone who deserved respect, not a lifetime of standing upright beside cleaning supplies. And in June of 1996, after more than 80 years, his afterlife finally changed course. With help from Reverend Michael Sandweg, the funeral home discovered that Bill had family buried in a nearby cemetery, and thus they'd arrange a proper burial. They even tried to give him some dignity by dressing him in a period-style tuxedo. His hair and mustache, or what was still intact after 90 years, were neatly combed, and his hands were rested over a bouquet of red and white carnations. He was placed in a varnished poplar casket with a gold trim. And then, between noon and 6 p.m., more than 350 people came to pay their respects. Many of them, if we're honest, were probably the same people who once poked him through that closet door. In the end, the saga of Deaf Bill is the story of a man who, after death, became something stranger than a ghost story, an actual exhibit, a local legend, a macabre rite of passage for generations of Alton kids, a lonely fisherman who vanished in life but became unforgettable in death, simply because nobody claimed him. Anyways, this all happened only about 30 years ago, so if this video reaches anyone who actually met Deaf Bill, did you see him? Did you touch his leathery arm? What did you think of this whole bizarre saga? Let me know down below. One November day in 1915, a diver named William Frenchy Deneau was laying cable at the bottom of the Chicago River when he suddenly bumped, literally, into something bizarre. Now, Frenchy wasn't a stranger to strange discoveries down there. Just months earlier, sadly, he'd been one of the divers recovering bodies from the Eastland disaster when a passenger ship capsized right there in the river and killed more than 800 people. Actually the deadliest shipwreck in Great Lakes history. But this time, what he found made no sense at all. He stubbed his toe on what turned out to be a 40-foot metal vessel, tubular, sharply pointed, and sitting silently on the riverbed, like it had been hiding there for ages. When authorities allowed him to salvage it, he cracked it open and found, because this story wasn't weird enough already, the remains of a human and a dog. Frenchie immediately became convinced that he'd discovered an ancient submarine, specifically the Fool Killer, a craft supposedly built by daredevil and accountant-turned-inventor Peter Neeson. Now, Peter Neeson was an absolute character, a bookkeeper who decided one day, you know what, I'd rather build death machines. His first Fool Killer invention was a foot-powered iron-keeled boat stuffed with airtight compartments, basically a Victorian hamster wheel of doom that he steered through the Niagara Rapids in the 1900s and somehow survived. But he didn't stop there. By 1904, he'd escalated to a pneumatic balloon boat, a sort of giant inflated bag around a little raft that he believed could go over water, ice, and maybe to the Arctic if he got lucky. So, on November 30th of 1904, he launched this floating balloon coffin from Chicago's Navy Pier, bound for Michigan City, Indiana. That said, a gale hit, and that was that. Neeson's body would wash ashore, his craft nearby, with reports suggesting he either suffocated inside or drowned trying to escape. A handwritten note inside reportedly said he expected to suffocate. That is peak 1800s inventor energy, if you ask me. But in Frenchie's version of events, Peter didn't die in 1904. He died in this submarine at the bottom of the Chicago River with his poor dog in tow. In reality, Frenchie either forgot Neeson had already died or he never knew. And to be fair, what he dragged out of the river didn't look anything like Neeson's balloon boat or any documented Fool Killer. Still, he hauled it up, slapping the name Fool Killer on it, and put it on display in a downtown Chicago arcade right next to the skee-ball game, which now leaves us, a century later, asking the same question Frenchie never could. What on earth did Frenchie actually find? That question would stay unanswered for about 100 years, until Mark Chrysler of the podcast The Constant dug into the mystery. After an episode on the Fool Killer, one of his listeners emailed him a photo of a 1906 life-saving powerboat, that's a direct quote of what it's called, and it looked nearly identical to this vessel. It's not definitive proof, but it's easily the best lead that anyone's ever had. Another theory ties the craft to an entirely different eccentric, one man named Laudner Darvantis Phillips, a Michigan City shoemaker who built submarines in the 1840s. Yes, shoemaker by day, submarine designer by night. To give you an impression of how this went, one of his early subs sank almost immediately because he forgot that propulsion was necessary on it. But drawings of his later models showed a pointed, tubular shape, a lot like the Chicago River find. Even stranger, records show this prototype sub was sold in 1871 to a man named William Neeson, which may have confused Frenchie into thinking Neeson equals Fool Killer, just with the wrong Neeson entirely. And as for where this vessel ended up, we know it spent time at the downtown arcade, and then that it made its way to a circus at an Iowa State Fair, where it was outshined by a performing monkey, and finally it wound up one day in Chicago's Riverview Park. After that, though, it disappeared from history. Most people assumed it was quietly scrapped during a World War I metal drive, which is exactly what would happen to a priceless historical artifact when no one realizes it's priceless. And as for the human and dog remains, well, records show that only 2 skulls were actually found inside, not full skeletons. Thus, some historians, frankly, think Frenchie might have just been exaggerating, or even planted the skulls because a mysterious underwater death machine draws way more ticket sales than a boring old rescue boat. If you ask me, this thing was almost certainly a lost early motorized rescue craft that sank and was forgotten, and probably wasn't worth the headache to recover. But I'd like to hear what you think. Had you heard of this story before, of the mystery submarine found at the bottom of Chicago's river? And does the rescue boat explanation fit, or is there another chapter waiting at the bottom of the river to be uncovered? If you've ever wandered through Schiller Woods Forest Preserve in Schiller Park, Illinois, near O'Hare, you might have noticed a small, unassuming water pump tucked among the trees. To the casual passerby, it's just another piece of Forest Preserve infrastructure. But to locals and devoted visitors, this is no ordinary pump. It's the Schiller Woods Magic Water Pump, famously named Chicago's Fountain of Youth. For decades, people have whispered that the water flowing from its spout isn't just refreshing, it's extraordinary. Some claim it improves health, boosts vigor, and even extends your life if you drink from it regularly. It's said to bring strength to the weary, healing to the sick, and sometimes a spark of mystery that defies explanation. Nowadays, a huge chunk of the pump's regulars are Polish Catholics from Chicago's enormous Polish community, and many of them believe that this pump was actually blessed by none other than Pope John Paul II during his 1979 visit to Chicago. There is, just to be clear, zero evidence for this, but that has not stopped the legend from becoming as sticky as a Chicago summer. As for truth behind it, the current pump was installed in 1945, replacing earlier versions dating back to the 1930s. From the very start, it drew attention. Visitors came from all over, hoping to experience its rumored transformative powers. A forest preserve superintendent in the 1950s would actually joke that if the handle broke, everyone in the office knew about it within an hour, which gives you a sense of just how popular this little pump has become. Further, there's not just mythology about its properties, but also about where this water comes from. Some devoted pump drinkers are convinced that the water isn't even local. Theories range from it being piped from Lake Superior, which is 630 miles away, to the water coming from Lake Huron, which is slightly closer, to my personal favorite, that it's a secret water supply for rich people, with no further elaboration. In the 1950s, even a forest preserve staffer insisted the water was coming from Lake Superior. And by the 1980s, officials had given up even trying to keep the mythology straight and just started calling it well water, which is probably the most accurate description. Now, to be clear, the water itself is interesting, if not exactly miraculous. It's untreated, and it's mineral-rich, and it has less copper and iron than Chicago's tap water in general. It also has a slightly higher pH and a crisp, clean taste that has drawn repeat visitors for generations. Some regulars, about a quarter of them, don't drink it for the magic, but simply because they like the taste. A few visitors even compare it to the mineral waters of Polish mountain spas, a subtle nod to the city's large Polish community, which makes up a significant portion, as we said, of the pump's devotees. Heck, in 2024, a local brewery even made a limited edition beer called Regeneration Station using the pump water. Folks, thank you so much for joining me on this venture through Illinois' strangest tales, and for hopefully tolerating the fact that I've got a case of the sniffles right now that I'm trying to get better from. Anyhow, again, I'm ambitiously going to try and see if what was once a small upstart of a channel could one day hit 1 million subs. And helping me with this is free. All you've got to do is comment and subscribe to the video. It's a quick way to say, hey YouTube, this guy's alright. Anyhow, with that, whether you were just canoeing down the Mississippi River and you found a gigantic mural of a bird, or if you made a wish upon that magic water by the O'Hare Airport and it came true, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.